Why? Why have I received a letter from my late mother-in-law? I was staring at the envelope that had arrived in my home mailbox, utterly astonished. The sender of the letter was none other than my mother-in-law, who we had just concluded her funeral yesterday. My mother-in-law had been incredibly kind to me since the beginning of my marriage, and I adored her dearly. We often went out to eat together, enjoyed shopping trips, and had grown close like friends despite our age difference. Her sudden passing left me utterly devastated. Even now, after the funeral, I still couldn't fully come to terms with the reality of her being gone. Amid this grieving period, receiving a letter from my mother-in-law left me profoundly surprised. Hastily checking the contents of the letter, I found something I never expected. First, the reason why I received this letter was that my mother-in-law had asked the temple priest to deliver it to me upon her passing. The letter instructed me to open the secret compartment in the family's chest, and revealed the existence of a hidden door. The instructions for opening the hidden door were detailed. At the end of the letter, there was a directive to be sure to open it alone. Checking the time, I realized my brother-in-law, his wife, and their children, with whom my mother-in-law lived at her house, were all out at work or school. Hurriedly, I made my way to my parent-in-law's house, entered using the spare key, and followed my mother-in-law's instructions to open the secret compartment in the chest alone. I did it. It's open. I sighed with relief, and examined the contents inside. What? This is. My name is Nancy. I'm 35 years old and work as a web designer from home. I got married to Tom, who is 4 years older than me. 5 years ago, a friend introduced him and our relationship as a couple is still very strong. However, we haven't been blessed with children yet. Both of us adore children and had hoped to have them soon after marriage, but unfortunately, we haven't been able to conceive. I used to struggle deeply and sometimes get depressed about not being able to have children. But there has always been someone who treats me kindly despite that. It was my mother-in-law.
Nancy, don't worry so much. There's no need to rush. Hey, how about we go together to the new waffle place near the station for a change of pace?
My mother-in-law always encouraged me and spoke warm words of comfort. Bright, kind, and caring, I deeply loved my mother-in-law. She saved me many times, and gradually, the times I fretted about having children decreased. Though I still desire children, I've opted not to pursue extensive infertility treatments but rather let things happen naturally. Since my husband Tom travels frequently for work, my mother-in-law and I often dine out or go shopping together during his absence, and we fostered a close bond akin to that of friends despite our age difference. My mother-in-law lives nearby with my brother-in-law's family, who have 3 children. While my mother-in-law seems to get along well with them, my brother-in-law and his wife frequently hurl insults at my husband and me, who are childless.
Nancy, you haven't had any children yet? We have 3 lovely kids here. Being childless is unfilial. Cut ties with your mother-in-law soon.
With a smug look, Amy, my brother-in-law's wife, says such things, and my brother-in-law Jason joins in, mocking us.
Amy's right. Well, Tom has never been impressive anyway. Even if you had kids, they wouldn't amount to much.
Initially, my husband and I would retort against such despicable remarks from my brother-in-law's family. However, since they never listened, we gradually stopped engaging with them and tried to avoid them as much as possible. My brother-in-law and his wife treat my husband and me with such a disrespectful attitude, but they act unnaturally nice in front of my mother-in-law. Consequently, my mother-in-law doesn't know their true nature. We didn't say anything to her about my brother-in-law and his wife's behavior because we didn't want to cause her any unnecessary worry. One holiday, my husband, my mother-in-law, and I planned to go out for a meal together. When the appointed time arrived, we headed to my parents-in-law's house. However, unlike usual, my mother-in-law wasn't waiting outside the door earlier than the appointed time. Is she not done getting ready yet? I wondered aloud.
It's unusual. Well, she should be coming out soon.
My husband replied. Neither my husband nor I thought much of it and waited for my mother-in-law to appear. However, as 5 minutes passed, then 10, she still didn't show up, nor did she answer her phone. I wonder what's going on with your mom. I began to feel uneasy. Feeling increasingly anxious, we rang the doorbell of my parents-in-law's house. With no response, we decided to use the spare key to enter.
Hey, Mom?
My husband called out as taking off his shoes at the entrance, but there was no response from inside. With a bad feeling, we hurriedly searched for my mother-in-law. Then, we found my mother-in-law collapsed in her bedroom. Oh my God! I exclaimed as I rushed to her side, and my husband immediately called for an ambulance. My brother-in-law's family must have been out together because besides my mother-in-law, there was no one else at the house. The ambulance arrived in about 8 minutes, and my mother-in-law was swiftly taken to the hospital. But unfortunately, she passed away there. It was a stroke. My husband and I couldn't accept the sudden loss of my mother-in-law. We cried so much that it felt like we would never stop. However, there were many things to do, like preparing for the funeral. We couldn't remain sad and despondent forever. The funeral was decided to be conducted as a family affair, and my brother-in-law assumed the role of the chief mourner. In order to properly conduct my mother-in-law's funeral for her sake, my husband and I collaborated with my brother-in-law, making preparations together. However, even during the arrangements with relatives and discussions with the funeral home, there was an unmistakable air of reluctance emanating from my brother-in-law. Although he showed no signs of grieving over my mother-in-law's death, he managed to fulfill his duties as the chief mourner during the wake and funeral. Yet, he would promptly summon my husband after he talked a bit with the relatives, and abruptly leave. Leaving the relatives made them offended, so they glared at my brother-in-law. Moreover, during the post-funeral gathering with relatives, my brother-in-law would be the first to take a seat. Also, he refused to budge even when my husband urged him to greet the guests. He simply sat there, sipping his beer. His wife was sitting beside him and did the same. So my husband and I circulated among the relatives, expressing gratitude for their presence and reminiscing about my mother-in-law. Perhaps seeing their parents merely eating and drinking set the tone, as my brother-in-law's 3 children immersed themselves in playing games. They occasionally laughed raucously and playfully nudged each other, creating an atmosphere that hardly resembled a post-funeral gathering. Not a single member of my brother-in-law's family appeared to mourn my mother-in-law's death. The relatives seemed to pick up on this attitude alone. Without even attempting to talk to my brother-in-law and his wife, they only bid farewell and shared memories with my husband and me. Despite the blatant change in the relatives' attitude, they remained unaffected. They kept ordering beer after beer, discussing inheritances, planning trips during mourning periods, and so on. After all the care they received from my mother-in-law while she was alive, how disrespectful these people are. I found myself casting disdainful glances at my brother-in-law's family. The next day, My husband left early in the morning for some procedures. I was staying at my home and intended to check the mailbox for the newspaper. Then, I noticed a letter inside. Who could it be from? Taking the letter and confirming it was addressed to me, I was surprised to find out that it was from my mother-in-law. Why would my mother-in-law send a letter? With astonishment, I returned to the living room to open the letter. Inside was something I had never expected. It seemed that my mother-in-law had asked the temple priest to arrange to send me this letter upon her passing. The letter contained instructions on how to open the chest, how to open the hidden compartment, and the contact information of the family lawyer. Finally, there was an instruction to ensure that,
Please make sure to open it by yourself.
I traced my mother-in-law's letter multiple times. Despite her slender frame, her handwriting was bold and strong. I took a deep breath quietly, feeling the powerful strokes of her handwriting, which truly reflected her way of life. Glancing at the clock hanging on the wall. It's 9:30. There should be no one in my parents-in-law's house now. With that muttered to myself, I hurriedly prepared to head to the family home. The children would likely be at school by now, and my brother-in-law and his wife should have left early this morning. According to the social media post by my brother-in-law's wife I saw this morning, they were planning an outing together. Also, they had their children go to school despite it being the day right after our grandmother's funeral. They seemed eager to enjoy their day off using bereavement leave. If that post was true, there should be nobody at the family home. I realized if I didn't go now, I might not get another chance. When I opened the front door of my parents-in-law's house with the spare key, I entered slowly. It's so sad that my mother-in-law, who always greeted me with a smile, isn't here. I held my aching chest and entered her room. The chest, said to be my mother-in-law's trousseau, is quite old. However, whether my mother-in-law occasionally tended to it or not, the chest opened smoothly. Then, just as the letter indicated, I reached for the hidden door at the back of the chest drawer. Thank goodness, it's open. I breathed a sigh of relief as I was able to open it safely. Then, I checked what was inside. There was another document, along with what was written in the letter. What is this? I stared at the documents and felt my mother-in-law's love, tears threatening to spill. I felt like staying there and crying, but I had to leave my parents-in-law's house as soon as possible. It wouldn't be good if someone came back and saw me. After all, the letter from my mother-in-law instructed, make sure to do it alone. After I returned home with all the documents, I contacted the family lawyer mentioned in the letter to inform them of my mother-in-law's passing. Then, as I was about to reach out to my husband and my brother-in-law's family to see if we could all gather this weekend, I received an email. It was from my sister-in-law. The email conveyed a sense of urgency, urging us to gather at my parents-in-law's house this weekend for some important news. What could my sister-in-law possibly want to discuss? I couldn't shake off a feeling of unease. Despite my doubts, declining seemed odd, so I decided to accept my sister-in-law's proposal. Over the weekend, I visited my parents-in-law's house with my husband and nervously participated in the discussion. My brother-in-law and his wife wore smug, unpleasant smiles, and their 3 children were nowhere to be seen. They must have been taken somewhere else. As soon as my husband and I took our seats, they presented a document.
This is the will left by my mother-in-law.
My sister-in-law declared loudly. The signature on the will was indeed my mother-in-law's, and the content stated that all assets would be inherited by my brother-in-law and his wife.
See, it's written here that we can inherit everything. So, unfortunately, you won't be able to get any inheritance. Too bad, huh?
My brother-in-law laughed uproariously, his face contorted with ugliness. While my husband looked bewildered, I stood up silently and secretly brought back the lawyer who had been waiting outside.
Who is this?
My brother-in-law and his wife sounded puzzled at the sudden appearance of the lawyer. My husband, unaware that the lawyer had been waiting outside, was also surprised. This person is the lawyer whom my mother-in-law was close to during her lifetime. I explained succinctly, and gradually my brother-in-law and his wife's vacant expressions turned into anger.
A lawyer? Why did you bring such a person here?
It's a part of my mother-in-law's instructions. She wanted the lawyer to mediate so that the estate division agreement could be smoothly drafted. My brother-in-law and his wife loudly proclaimed that they didn't need a lawyer. My brother-in-law slammed the desk again and pointed at my mother-in-law's will with his chin.
My mother left a will. With this, we don't need a lawyer.
At those words, the lawyer quietly raised his hand.
Is there any doubt that your mother wrote the entire content herself?
In response to the question, my brother-in-law raised his voice.
That's obvious.
The lawyer looked troubled and shook his head vigorously.
This cannot be recognized as a will. A holographic will must be entirely handwritten by the testator.
The lawyer pointed to the words, "will," written at the beginning and my mother-in-law's signature at the end. The handwriting looked familiar, but everything else seemed printed, probably from a computer. The living room, which had been so noisy, fell silent. My brother-in-law reached out to the will in front of him, but no matter what he did, the content remained unchanged. It was just neatly printed in Gothic font.
Huh?
Suddenly, my husband pointed at my brother-in-law.
Why is the back of the paper so clean?
I squinted at my husband's words, and indeed, there was something odd about the will.
The handwriting in the signature section is different from the rest. Could this be a forged will?
My brother-in-law and his wife trembled at the lawyer's observation.
What are you talking about? We wouldn't do such a thing. Why are you so tense? If it's forged, what will you say?
The lawyer interjected.
Forgery of a will constitutes the crime of forging a private document.
Upon hearing this, my brother-in-law and his wife turned pale. Although they were agitated and making incomprehensible excuses, the lawyer delivered the decisive blow.
Nancy has a notarized will, so your will is invalid.
What?
My brother-in-law and his wife were shocked, eyes wide open.
What's that? We never heard of it.
The letter I received from my mother-in-law mentioned hiding a notarized will behind the hidden door of the chest. We didn't know either. In the letter we received earlier, my mother-in-law revealed the hiding place to us. The letter contained not only practical information but also explained why she made the notarized will and why she told me about it. My mother-in-law had been feeling her health decline lately and had prepared the will, but she probably suspected that my brother-in-law and his wife might tamper with it. I had assumed that my mother-in-law was completely unaware of my brother-in-law and his wife's true nature, but it seemed she had a vague sense of their greed. The notarized will stated that the assets would be divided equally between my brother-in-law and my husband.
What? She had prepared something like this.
My brother-in-law and his wife were astonished, eyes wide open. Then, my brother-in-law's expression changed suddenly, and he shouted loudly.
Oh, yes. I'm supposed to be the beneficiary of Mom's life insurance, as the eldest son. isn't it?
With a glaring look in his eyes, my brother-in-law yelled. I responded in a cold voice. Besides the notarized will, your mother entrusted me with the life insurance certificate as well. And the beneficiary is me. Inside the hidden door of the chest, there was not only the notarized will but also the life insurance certificate. My brother-in-law and his wife looked incredulous at the notarized will and the life insurance certificate, staring intently.
I didn't hear about this. I don't know anything about this.
The lawyer interjected.
Changing the beneficiary of a life insurance policy doesn't necessarily require notifying the original beneficiary.
Although my brother-in-law insisted he didn't know, slamming the table hard, the lawyer cut him off. My husband turned to me.
When did Mom entrust such a thing to Nancy? I didn't know anything about it. Maybe she didn't want to tell me.
He asked anxiously. I smiled at my husband and told him. It was written in the letter I received from your mother. She actually wanted to tell you about it too, but she was worried that if both of us were involved, your brother and his wife would become suspicious. So, she entrusted it to me alone.
I see. There's no wonder because Mom and you were really close.
While my husband and I were talking, my sister-in-law barged in hysterically.
I can't accept this. Why should you two, who didn't even show your children to my mother-in-law, inherit her estate? This is ridiculous. I can't accept this at all.
My brother-in-law joined in, his face turning red as he shouted.
Exactly. You unlucky bunch have no right to Mom's estate. We were living here together just for her inheritance. Splitting it equally? Don't make me laugh. The inheritance is all ours.
My sister-in-law continued to shout, adding to his selfish claims.
We have 3 children. As compensation for not showing my mother-in-law any grandchildren, you should give all of her inheritance to our children for their future. We have shown 3 grandchildren, so we are much greater than you. The inheritance belongs to us.
Despite my sister-in-law's aggressive tone, I remained calm. What you've been saying is nonsensical. Please calm down a bit. My composed demeanor seemed to infuriate my sister-in-law even more.
Your calm attitude annoys me so much. Just give us the money already. You're a useless, childless woman.
She yelled and lunged at me. My husband and the lawyer intervened, but before they could stop her, my sister-in-law punched me in the head. Ouch! She had several large rings on her fingers, so they were like a makeshift brass knuckles. I involuntarily cried out at the dull pain.
Stop it.
My husband and the lawyer pulled my sister-in-law away, but she attempted to reach for me again in her agitated state.
Give us the inheritance. I deserve to have it all more than you do. I have 3 children.
Her eyes were bloodshot, and her face was twisted like a demon's. My brother-in-law goaded her on, saying things like,
Hit her more.
And my enraged husband called the police. When the police arrived shortly after, my husband and the lawyer explained the situation. My brother-in-law and his wife were then escorted away by the police. My husband and I thanked the lawyer and decided to send him home for today. What was supposed to be a discussion about creating an estate division agreement turned into a chaotic ordeal. My husband and I nodded in agreement to bring a gift of apology the other day. My husband was deeply concerned about me being hit by my sister-in-law, but he seemed relieved when I told him the headache had completely subsided. In the light of the whole tumultuous sequence of events, I murmured, "It's been quite an intense time." Then, my husband brought up something unexpected.
Hey, Amy seems to constantly flaunt about the children, you know? She always boasted about showing Mom 3 grandchildren and how great she was. And, don't you think she's overly fixated on money?
Indeed. My sister-in-law had been excessively promoting her children and exhibited an intense fixation on money during the earlier altercation about money. Well, she has been quite vocal about the children for a while, and her obsession with money was indeed extreme. Her expression while hitting me was terrifying.
Yeah, you're right. It's a bit abnormal.
After saying that, my husband fell into a pensive silence. What's wrong? Is there something bothering you? Not understanding what my husband was getting at, I inquired.
Well, there's something bothering me, and I'm considering suggesting it to my brother. I think it might be a good idea to have DNA tests done for their 3 children.
My husband's response surprised me. What? DNA tests?
Yeah, and I'm also thinking about proposing a background check on Amy. Something doesn't sit right with me. It's just a gut feeling.
While I honestly thought it might be unnecessary, my husband's intuition had been accurate in the past. Okay. If that's what Tom suggests, let's propose it to your brother. Later on, when my husband told my brother-in-law about the matter, it seemed my brother-in-law ridiculed and yelled at him extensively.
Just because you don't have kids yourselves, don't doubt ours.
That's what my brother-in-law shouted, but before parting ways, he apparently insisted on taking materials about DNA testing from my husband. Perhaps my brother-in-law had some thoughts about it as well. The first revelation came from the DNA testing between my brother-in-law and his children. It turned out that 2 out of 3 of his children didn't share his blood.
Oh, I was a bit suspicious of the youngest because their face doesn't resemble either of us much, but I didn't expect the middle one to.
My husband was speechless. Whether from this revelation or not, my brother-in-law thoroughly investigated his wife's background. The results were damning. It appeared that my sister-in-law had relationships with multiple men even before marrying my brother-in-law. Moreover, recently, her affairs were exposed to the wives of her lovers, who were now demanding compensation. As my sister-in-law spent more time at home than my brother-in-law did, she meticulously hid any notices like registered letters. Looking at the details, the total amount of compensation was far beyond what my sister-in-law earned or had in savings. In the end, my sister-in-law was hell-bent on seizing my mother-in-law's inheritance for herself at any cost. It was the natural progression of events, but my brother-in-law and sister-in-law ended up in a violent brawl, throwing things and exchanging blows until blood was shed. Unable to bear the noise, neighbors called the police, and both of them were taken into custody by the arriving officers. Already facing charges for forging our mother-in-law's will, they now faced additional charges of assault. Upon further investigation by the police, it emerged that they had committed theft and harassed wealthy individuals, among other offenses. Eventually, my brother-in-law and his wife ended up behind bars. As for the future of the 3 children left behind, my husband and I were deeply troubled. Since my mother-in-law's passing, we were the closest relatives to them. We considered taking them in, but after much deliberation, we decided against it. The children had been thoroughly indoctrinated by my brother-in-law and his wife to the point where they casually referred to my husband and me as,
"You are childless incompetence."
The eldest, at 14, should be old enough to discern right from wrong, and the youngest, at 7, should have some understanding of acceptable behavior. Yet, every time they saw us, they smirked and spewed insults. Even with their parents in trouble or at the center of a controversy, their mindset remained unchanged. To hear our nephew, who is 14, saying,
"We'd be better off being raised by childless idiots,"
was beyond anything we could have imagined. Being subjected to such words, we couldn't summon any love for the children or any hope of raising them to be decent individuals. Ultimately, we reached out to my sister-in-law's parents and decided to sever ties with the children from then on. It seems the children themselves understood our resolve, as our nephew remarked,
"I'd rather live in Grandma's old shack than with the brainless childless couple."
With that words, we felt that it was the best way for them. For the record, we have not disclosed to the children the fact that the younger two are not biologically related to my brother-in-law. Whether we reveal the truth or not, we leave it to my brother-in-law and his wife's relatives to decide. My husband and I decided to move to a distant place, using the inheritance left by my mother-in-law as our financial source, and start anew. It's a place abundant with greenery and nature, where both my husband and I quickly felt at home. There's a charming waffle shop near our house, and every time we pass by it, we reminisce about my mother-in-law, wishing she could have gone there with us. Soon after the move, I was blessed with the child I had longed for. When the pregnancy test showed a positive result, I couldn't help but scream with surprise and happiness. Later, when I visited the obstetrician, the doctor confirmed without a doubt that I was pregnant. Both my husband and I shed tears of joy as we embraced each other. How much my mother-in-law would have rejoiced if she were still alive. Additionally, the entrepreneurial plan I had secretly been preparing for is progressing smoothly. Both my husband and I are working hard for the child on the way, enjoying fulfilling days full of happiness.